The Pentagon called our unit on a Tuesday morning in April and asked for the analyst behind the work. They called my name, not Colonel Reeves, not the man who had been presenting my analysis in briefings for 3 years, attaching his name to my methodology, collecting commendations for work that I had produced in the early hours of the morning in an office that smelled like cold coffee and recycled air. Not the man who had, over 3 years, built a significant portion of his reputation on assessments I had written and frameworks I had developed and conclusions I had reached through the kind of rigorous, patient analytical work that does not announce itself loudly, but that produces results that people at very high levels eventually notice. They called my name, Captain Claire Hartley, intelligence analyst, 12 years of service, 3 deployments, a record that, I understood this, I had always understood this, even in the years when it was not being credited to me, was exceptional. I was called to brief the Pentagon on a Wednesday in May. Colonel Reeves was in the room when I walked in. I need to tell you about the work before I tell you about the room, because the work is what everything else turns on. I am an intelligence analyst. I will not describe the specific nature of my work because classification requirements are not something I can work around even in a personal account, but I will describe it in general terms. I analyze complex information and produce assessments that inform decisions. I am good at this. I have been good at it for 12 years, and I have become better at it with each year in the specific way that analytical skills improve when they are applied consistently to high-stakes problems. 3 years ago, I was assigned to Colonel Reeves's unit. He was a decorated officer, well regarded at the command level, with the kind of reputation that accumulates over a career of being in the right places and saying the right things to the right people. He was not, as I came to understand over the first 6 months of working for him, a particularly strong analyst. He was a strong communicator, a strong presence in rooms, a strong manager of the relationships that matter in a military career. But the analytical work, the sitting down with complex information and finding the thing in it that changes how you understand the situation, that was not where his strength was. It was where mine was. The arrangement that developed was not stated explicitly. Nothing was stated explicitly. What happened was that my analysis began to appear in his briefings, first occasionally, then regularly, then consistently. My frameworks became the unit's frameworks. My conclusions became the colonel's conclusions, delivered in his voice in rooms I was not in, to people I had not met. He did not take my documents and present them unchanged. He was too careful for that. He absorbed them, reprocessed them through his own language and presentation style, and delivered them as the product of his thinking. The substance was mine. The credit was his. I knew this. My colleagues knew this. The people who worked closely with us knew this. What we did not know, for 3 years, was whether the people above us, the people in the rooms Colonel Reeves was briefing, knew it too. It turned out they did not know it. Until they needed to find out. The request from the Pentagon came through official channels, in the specific, formal language of official channels. Our unit had produced analysis, a body of work over the preceding 18 months that had attracted attention at a level above our command. The request was for the analyst responsible for a specific methodology that had appeared consistently across the work. The request named the methodology. I had developed that methodology. I had written it, named it internally, applied it consistently across the 18 months of work it had appeared in. It was mine in the way that analytical frameworks are the property of the person who builds them, not legally, not on paper, but in the specific, traceable way that ideas have signatures when you know what to look for. Colonel Reeves received the request. I know what happened in the 24 hours after he received it, because his aide, a young lieutenant named Torres, who had worked with us for a year and who had a clear-eyed understanding of the unit's actual dynamics, told me. Reeves had tried to position himself as the appropriate briefer. He had suggested to the liaison officer who conveyed the request that he was the senior analyst responsible for the methodology and that he was the appropriate person to present it. The liaison officer, following instructions from a level that did not leave room for interpretation, had said the request was specifically for Captain Hartley, not the colonel, the captain. Torres told me this the morning before I was officially notified. He said it in the careful way of someone who understands the significance of what they are conveying and who wants to make sure the person receiving it has time to prepare. I thanked him. Then I went back to my desk and I spent the rest of that day and most of that night preparing the briefing. I want to tell you about the preparation because it is the part of this story that I think matters most and that is the least dramatic and the most important. I did not prepare to expose Colonel Reeves. I want to be clear about that. The briefing I prepared was the briefing I had been asked to give, a presentation of the methodology, its development, its application, its results, its implications for the problems the Pentagon was working on. My job was to be the analyst I was, not to be the person who corrected the record, not to be the person who made a point about what had been happening for 3 years. My job was to walk into that room and do the work at the level the work deserved to be done at. I prepared for 16 hours, not because I needed 16 hours to understand the material. I had been living with this material for 3 years, and I understood it at a depth that no amount of briefing preparation could improve on. I prepared for 16 hours because the room I was walking into deserved 16 hours, because the people in that room were making decisions that mattered, and they deserved the best version of what I had built. At 0300, I made a second cup of coffee, and I went through the briefing one final time. And I thought about 3 years of early mornings and cold coffee, and the recycled air office, and the work that had gone out of that office under someone else's name. And I thought, tomorrow it comes back. I arrived at the Pentagon at 0730. I had been to the Pentagon before in earlier stages of my career in the way that officers moved through institutional spaces over the course of a career, but I had not been to this particular room, at this level, in this capacity. I will not describe the room in detail because the description is not mine to give publicly. What I will tell you is that it was a room where the people present were people whose names appear in the histories of decisions that shape things. I was escorted in at 0800. Colonel Reeves was in the front row. I saw him the moment I entered. He was in his dress uniform with his commendations, sitting with the presentation of a senior officer in a room where he expected to be significant. He had been invited to attend. I learned later that the unit had been represented at the briefing level by him and at the analyst level by me, a distinction that had been clear in the invitation, but that he had perhaps not fully processed. He saw me when I entered. He did not look away immediately. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen from him before, something more complicated than what I had expected, not hostility, not the managed performance of a senior officer managing a subordinate, something that was closer to the expression of a man watching something arrive that he has known on some level was always going to arrive. Then he looked at the table. I set up my materials. I was introduced. I began. I am not going to give you the content of the briefing because it is classified and because the content is not the point. The point is what happened in the room, and what happened in the room was this. I presented the methodology in the way that only the person who built it can present it, not from a briefing document, not from someone else's summary, but from the inside, from the understanding of why each element was constructed the way it was, what alternatives had been considered and rejected, what the framework was built to do and what it was not built to do, and how to tell the difference. The people in that room asked questions. I answered them, specifically, technically, with the depth of someone who had spent 3 years developing the material and who knew every corner of it. Approximately 40 minutes into the briefing, a senior officer, I will not identify her rank or position, asked a question about the origin of a specific element of the methodology. The question was the kind of question that senior analysts ask when they want to understand not just what something is, but how it came to be what it is, the kind of question that has no good answer except the honest one. I gave the honest answer. I described the development of that element, the problem I had been trying to solve, the approaches I had considered, the specific insight that had produced the solution. I described it in the first person, in the past tense, with the specific detail of someone describing their own thinking. The senior officer looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at the room. Then she looked at Colonel Reeves. She said, "Colonel, you've been presenting this work at the command level for 18 months. Can you speak to the development of this element?" Colonel Reeves said something. I did not look at him while he said it. I looked at the table in front of me, and I kept my face exactly as it had been throughout the briefing. Attentive, professional, the face of a person doing their job. What he said was not wrong exactly, but it was the answer of someone who has absorbed someone else's work through summaries rather than through the building of it. It was the answer of a man who understood the what but not the why, the framework but not the foundation, the conclusion but not the thinking that had produced it. The senior officer heard the answer. She did not say anything more about it at that moment. She thanked the colonel and returned her attention to me and asked another question, and the briefing continued. But the room had understood something. I did not have to say it. The room had understood it from the difference between my answer and his.
I was asked to remain after the briefing for a follow-on conversation. Colonel Reeves was not. I will not tell you what was said in that conversation because it is not mine to share in its entirety. What I will tell you is that the questions were about my analytical background, my career trajectory, my previous work, and my availability for a specific kind of engagement that I had not previously been considered for. They were not asking about the colonel. I left the Pentagon at 1400. I drove back to the base in the specific quiet of someone who has been through something significant and who has not yet fully processed what it means. I had not exposed Colonel Reeves. I had not made a statement, had not filed a complaint, had not done anything except walk into a room and answer questions honestly about work I had done. The room had reached its own conclusions. The people in that room were people who knew the difference between the person who builds a thing and the person who presents it. They had heard the difference. The formal process that followed, the review, the reassignment, the career consequences for Colonel Reeves, is not something I will detail because it involves institutional processes that are not mine to describe publicly and people whose careers are their own business. What I will tell you is that it happened, that the room on the Wednesday in May was the beginning of a process that produced a different accounting than the one that had been operating for 3 years, and that I am, as of the writing of this account, in a position that reflects the work I have been doing rather than the position that reflected the work someone else had been presenting. The work found its way back to me. It always does, eventually. Real work has a signature. People who know what they are looking at can read it, and the people in that room on that Wednesday morning in May knew exactly what they were looking at.
I want to say something to every woman who is doing excellent work that is not being credited to her. Keep the records, not because you need to expose anyone, not because you are building a case, not because you are planning a confrontation. Keep the records because the work is yours, and the record of the work should reflect that, and because the room eventually asks who built this, you want to be able to answer that question with specificity and depth, and the kind of detail that only the person who actually built it can provide. The work is yours. The signature is in the work. The people who know what to look for will eventually look. Be ready when they do. Keep doing the work at the level it deserves, in the early mornings with the cold coffee and the recycled air, because the work requires it and because 12 years of doing it at that level produces something that cannot be faked by someone who only presented it. And when the Pentagon calls your name and not his, walk in, set up your materials, do the briefing, and answer every question from the inside of the work. She doesn't stay silent. She doesn't stay broken. She rises. Sometimes rising is walking into a room where the person who took your work is sitting in the front row and doing the work so well that the room understands everything without you having to say a word. Subscribe. New story every week, and every single one of them ends the same way. She rises. Leave a comment. Has someone ever taken credit for your work? Tell me what happened. I read every single one.